Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. Hello, I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, historian and independent researcher, and I'll be your host. Today's podcast episode will explore the issue of the Great Reset, the rush to net zero, and environment, sustainability, and governance, or ESG scores. In June 2020, 3 months after the global lockdown for COVID-19 began, Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum and various corporate and political stakeholders launched the Great Reset initiative. Schwab declared, and I quote, "Every country from the United States to China must participate, and every industry from oil and gas to tech must be transformed. In short, we need a great reset of capitalism. One silver lining of the pandemic is that it has shown how quickly we can make radical changes to our lifestyles." End quote. The transformation outlined by the Great Reset includes the following. Governments will direct markets. Wealth taxes will facilitate equality of outcome. Recovery stimulus packages will be green. Investments will be directed for equality and sustainability. And the digital transformation of society, in line with the Fourth Industrial Revolution, will be accelerated. To a net zero energy transition and ESG metrics. This Great Reset is being adopted in Canada, the EU, and is embraced now by the Biden administration. The World Economic Forum and its Great Reset initiative is comprehensive, thorough, and well organized. A Great Reset Internet Hub has been established. It offers detailed research and policy prescriptions as well as some practical applications, which resemble variations of a global Green New Deal. There are 19 different platforms for shaping the future, from the promotion of digitalization to a circular economy, to the Common Pass, an electronic health identification app to facilitate travel post-COVID. There were weekly Great Reset dialogues. There's a Radio Davos podcast and a separate Great Reset podcast where different experts are interviewed to discuss the proposed changes and how to accelerate them. In July 2020, Klaus Schwab published a book called COVID-19, The Great Reset, detailing his plans. Time magazine ran an issue detailing the Great Reset, not as a conspiracy, but as a reasonable plan for the future. While COVID has served as the catalyst to implement a Great Reset, climate change is the rationale for revolution in pursuing a net zero transition and ESG scores. The goal is to transform the entire global system by ending fossil fuel production and consumption in the Western developed countries and transitioning to a technocratic, decarbonized net zero civilization. This forced energy transition means reducing global human carbon dioxide emissions to zero or net zero. It is important to realize that this forced energy transition is a move from a system of efficiency and reliability to the exact opposite. Not only that, this controlled narrative does not convey the impossible struggle to get to a net zero world. It does not convey the sudden and significant drop in our living standard that's a requirement to get to zero emissions. It does not convey the likelihood of human suffering it will bring in its wake. But none of this can succeed without the support of the financial industry and the public. Financial institutions are pressuring companies and investors to toe the ESG line and compel divestment from companies that aren't green or inclusive enough. It won't be long before this trickles down to individual citizens, where every action and decision will be measured based on ESG scores, something very similar to the social credit system operating in China. These changes are not benign, nor are they altruistic. They serve to undermine and destroy our modern way of life, and the hydrocarbons changes to how we do business. It's a complete system change. Our current system, based on reliable and affordable hydrocarbons and a market economy, is not perfect. Can any human system be perfect? But it has improved the lives of more people in the world than ever in history. Unlike any other system, it has improved the care of our environment and planet. This is a system worth keeping and fighting for. Today I'll be speaking with Dr. Sterling Burnett of the Heartland Institute on this global plan called the Great Reset, the proposed transition to net zero, and how this fits with the new ESG metrics being forced onto businesses, financial institutions, and personal decisions. Before we begin, let me introduce Dr. Burnett, Senior Fellow on Environmental Policy and the Managing Editor of Environment and Climate News at the Heartland Institute. He's the editor of Heartland's Climate Change Weekly email and the host of the Environment and Climate News podcast. Prior to joining the Heartland Institute in 2014, Dr. Burnett worked at the National Center for Policy Analysis for 18 years, ending his tenure there as Senior Fellow in charge of environmental policy. He has held various positions in professional and public policy organizations, including serving as a member of the Environment and Natural Resources Task Force in the Texas Comptroller's eTexas Commission. Dr. Burnett received his Ph.D. at Green State University with a specialization in environmental ethics. Dr. Burnett.
Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
I just wanted to say that I found the Heartland Institute's Climate Realism and Climate at a Glance websites incredibly helpful. I think they provide a wealth of digestible information on a range of issues, and I'm so grateful for the work and effort in putting them together.
Yeah, those have been projects. I've been doing something called Climate Change Weekly, a weekly newsletter since I've been on board for 7 years, but it's been going on since 2011. So it's been 10 years now. We just celebrated our 400th issue.
Wow.
But the Climate at a Glance and Climate Realism websites, we just launched actually in, I think, April of last year. They've been very popular. We try and produce basically short responses to Climate at a Glance is short summaries of what we know about climate science on different issues, from hurricanes to droughts to temperature readings, basically the things that persist over time. And Climate Realism tries to respond to daily news items.
Right.
Mostly news items that are hyping false claims. And then we respond to those false claims with data showing that they are false. But sometimes promoting little recognized accurate depictions of the state of the climate and explaining why those are accurate and why we should be hearing more about that than the falsehoods. If you don't mind, I'd like to take a second to respond to your introduction.
Sure.
I won't claim to be an expert on the Great Reset itself. I know you originally reached out to Justin Haskins on that. He deferred to me because I deal with the environment issues, and much of it is dealing with the environment. But my background is applied philosophy and ethics and political philosophy. And the truth is, the Great Reset, you said it's the fourth industrial revolution. No, it is the de-revolution. It's a de-evolution of the economy. And all it is it's an Orwellian renaming of capitalism. It is socialism. It is to some degree national socialism. By which I mean, under communism, Marx's vision, the state, the proletariat, controlled everything directly. They owned the means of production. Under National Socialism, the state left the means of production with private parties, but basically they told private parties what they will be doing with those means of production. And that's what the Great Reset does. It says, we are an elite, we know best, leaders, big tech leaders, basically major companies that don't like competition from smaller firms, from private parties, global economic elites, academics, and they say, we know best how the world ought to be shaped. This is the first time ever this has occurred.
Yeah.
Even the UN, Christina Figueres, who used to run the UN's climate thing, said this is the first time in history we are trying to intentionally remake the economy. So they're trying to remake the world economy. A relatively small group of people think they know best how everybody in the world ought to live. And that's never been done or presumed before. The arrogance of this plan is amazing. I don't like to think I have much of a large ego, but even when I think I'm good at certain things, I never presume I know best for everybody else. And that's what they do. They have a vision of the world, and it turns out it's a vision of the world around, pre 1900, because to get to where they want to get with carbon dioxide emissions, with greenhouse gas emissions, it would put us at the economic conditions of net zero. Well, that's never been. We always produce. Every time we exhale, we produced carbon dioxide, and every time we even before we had industrial civilization, we burned wood or dung, as they still have to do in many developing countries. That's not net zero. So we've never been there, but to get the 80% that they wanted to do initially by 2050 under the Paris Accords, that was 80%. Now they say we got to be at zero.
Yeah.
That would put us at the production of greenhouse gases that was in the 1820s worldwide. Now, I'm
Yes.
sorry,
Yeah.
I can't speak for everybody else, but I sort of like indoor plumbing and modern conveniences like air conditioning and heating and transportation systems that get me across the country, not in 6 months or a year, but in days at most, but hours usually. Uh, it would, of necessity, to get to net zero, we have to wipe all that out.
Yeah. I agree. And I'm so glad you framed it that way, because part of the problem in trying to understand and communicate what this is really about, people don't like to hear the word fascism because it's
Mm,
been linked to all these other things. And
yeah.
I've heard people say, well, it's not communism, it's not socialism, it's technocracy and whatnot. But the reality, and I think it's deliberate that they don't want people to be able to identify it as being a form of fascism, like a technocratic fascism, or however one wishes to describe it. But it is like it's exactly what you describe. And as a student of history, as someone who's examined how Nazism came to power and how fascism operated in Germany and Italy, I mean, this is, alarm bells are going off. And so
I
I'm
mean,
really glad that you framed it like that.
they want to get rid of oil and coal, natural gas. They want to get rid of companies that do that, and they want to promote wind and solar. And so people will own privately own wind and solar companies. People will privately own battery manufacturers. But basically, the governments, the elite, will dictate that this is the only energy used. So they're
Right.
directly favoring one industry, and they say, "Oh no, it's still capitalism, it's still private property," but it's not. When capitalism and free markets arose, not because government decided what goods and services people would use and what was desirable for people. People decided that, and entrepreneurs uh, found ways to meet people's desires. This is the complete opposite of that. The
Right.
elite has decided what people should desire, and then they're going to force companies to produce only what they think people should desire.
Right. What's sufficient? Yeah, right. I mean, this is how they always word it, is that whatever is sufficient for you. Well, who's making that decision?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
Well,
so
uh,
so one of the interesting things about the Great Reset is this idea of the fourth industrial revolution and bringing um, artificial intelligence into things, because some of
mm,
the things they talk about is that, well, if you're worried about people making these decisions and the technocrats or whatever, maybe we'll just leave those decisions up to artificial intelligence. We'll provide a little algorithm and they'll
yeah.
decide what it is, right? And so
Uh,
which is distressing.
I don't know about you. I know they're just movies, but I've seen enough sci-fi movies and read enough science fiction growing up to know that relying on unemotional uh, computers or computer algorithms that have no personal connection with anybody and thus no personal connection with life itself, don't care a whit about life and whether people thrive. I I'm sorry, I don't trust computers with that. I don't trust artificial intelligence to decide for me what I should care about, how I should live, where I should travel or live. That's 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 scarier than the elite controlling it, because at least with the elite you might persuade, entice, or I don't know, uh,
Bribe.
bribe them. Yeah, you might be able to appeal to their mercy or sense of decency if they have any. But with computers, there is no such thing. You can't build in emotions.
Right.
You can't build in the idea of mercy or not sufficiency. Sufficiency is calorie count, right? You know,
Yeah.
how many calories do I need? It's not abundance. It's not thriving. It's not just the calories you want to survive. It's the variety of foods that you want to try, the different taste sensations you want to experience, the different cultures. That's nothing. Sufficiency says nothing about that.
Absolutely. And in reading Klaus Schwab's book, The Great Reset and COVID-19 Great Reset, he talks about how this is this bold, amazing opportunity to make these changes. And then he gives this sort of argument against business as usual or returning to normal. He wants this new normal. But he's like, do we give too great a priority of being selfish and over focused on ourselves? And the implication is that if you want to choose to do all these other things that aren't just simply sufficient, like we're living like Buddhist monks or something, what he wants, then you're somehow being bad. And so they make it this moral argument that if you want normal, you are somehow being immoral and unethical.
Well,
And
it's just the opposite of the case.
exactly.
My parents' generation and their parents' generation, they didn't want for themselves. They wanted better lives for their children and grandchildren. Not sufficient lives, better lives. They wanted them to have more than previous generations have. They wanted them to live longer, to live more well, to thrive. They didn't want them to be T.H. Huxley drones wearing orange everywhere. Everyone wears an orange jumpsuit, and the government decides who gets to be with who, and they keep them happy by keeping them doped up. No,
Yeah.
there are a variety of things that make people happy, and different people are made happy in different ways. But what we do know is that the parents of one generation, in general, have always wanted their children and their children's children to be better off than they are. They wanted to leave legacies. These elites' legacies, to be fair, to be honest, they've got two sets of legacies. They want the legacy for their elite, and then they want the legacy for everybody else. And everybody else is supposed to be in the orange jumpsuits all the time. No differentiation between males and females, no differentiation. No, we shouldn't be wearing makeup and trying to be attractive. We should be happy with everyone being the same, the drones. But for them, they're not giving up their private jets. They're not giving up their private yachts. They're not giving up their meetings, never in disaster areas or in places of high poverty, but always in exclusive resorts with 5-star meals.
Exactly.
They've got a vision of the world where they and their children do better off, but everybody else and everybody else's children live sufficiently.
Well, I think this is why they were so clever in using the Build Back Better, resilient recovery type of rhetoric after, when the lockdowns began and whatnot, because it's a way to sort of convince the public to voluntarily give up these things, because who can argue against building back better? Why wouldn't we want to do better, sort of thing? But this type of socialist, fascist worldview it always seems to be wrapped up in these sort of platitudinal niceties that always appear on the surface to be moralistic and good. but inevitably result, like you say, in an increase in poverty and misery for those who aren't part of the elite, who aren't part of Klaus Schwab and his friends' little group. So it's just very fascinating to see how they employ that rhetoric, try to make it this moral argument. And if you disagree, if you put up an argument and say, hey, wait a second, what you're saying there isn't right, and it's going to bring like quite a lot of misery to humanity, then they immediately come up with, well, you're a conspiracy theorist. So,
Well,
when people say that the Great Reset and all this is a conspiracy, how would you respond?
well, normally people think of conspiracy as something that's hidden, but since they're so open about this, it is hard to say it's a conspiracy. They are openly advocating socialism with them at the top.
Yeah.
That's what they're calling for. They're not hiding it. They may be couching it in kind terms, but that's just false advertising. That's just modern advertising, trying to convince people to want something they don't really want. Lord Acton said a long time ago, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And they are corrupt. Now, they're corrupt for a variety of reasons. I don't think every one of these people wants power just for themselves so they can enrich themselves, so that they live well while everyone does badly. I think a lot of them are moral scolds who think that they have a vision of the world that they believe is a better vision of the world, and they paternalistically think you don't understand. The average person doesn't understand. We're going to force you not to be free. We're going to force you. We're going to force you to live sufficiently because it's better for you. I think there are the people who are really in it because it does well for them, and there are the people who are moral fanatics who are in it because they believe, under their vision of the world, it does better for everybody. I had a friend in graduate school. He was from Sierra Leone, and he was a communist. He was an avowed communist. He was proud of it. And we went to a conference one time, and we were sitting in Buffalo at a professor's house in a hot tub in the middle of winter. So snow is piled up all around us, and we're sipping wine. And I said, Chidi, if I were to take a picture of you right now and send it to your comrades, they'd put you against the wall. You're the worst case of bourgeoisie. And he says, no, man, you don't understand. I want everyone to live like this. and I think he did. But he thinks that it just falls like manna from heaven. It doesn't require hard work and individual effort. And you know what? Not everybody wants to live like this. There are people. They have entire programs about these people who want to live off the grid. Not everyone wants to live the high and mighty lifestyle, but there are those that do, there are those that don't, and there are all those people in between who just want to ensure their children have a better life than they do, that they can take their vacations when they want to, where they want to, that their houses can have 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms, or some that want to live in small huts off the grid. But the point is, there's a variety. For each individual person, they have their vision of what the good life is, and no elite. There is no standard version given down from the heavens, from some God's eye point of view, that fits everybody. But they want the global elite, the people pushing this Great Reset, believe that there is, and that they have the insight into which one it is. That's the arrogance. That's the arrogance.
I love how you just described free choice, because it's people have the free will and the free choice to decide how they want to live. There's the organic preppers who are out there off, like you said, off the grid and everything else, and that's their choice. They're not trying to force everybody to be a prepper. And it's the elites want to force everybody into their vision of what's sufficient. And that's so problematic on so many levels, especially in what's supposed to be a free democracy. And my
No,
concern
no.
is that once you have freedom, like, and they take it away, once they get what they want,
No.
democracy, I think, will go out the window.
Well, let me correct that because I'm going to disagree with you there. We don't have a democracy in America. You're in Canada, in the UK, they have different systems. They have the parliamentary system. In America, we have a republic because they don't trust. They no more trust a global elite to rule um, the people of the United States than they trust the mob. Then they trust just everyone voting on everything. No, we have a republic. They say our founding document, the Constitution, says people have certain fundamental rights that democracy may not take away, nor may elites. There's a realm of free action within which politics has no say. And that puts restraints on even democracy. And that's the point: is they want to they want to use democracy to crush rights or to propose their version of rights. And then, as you say, once democracy has destroyed the area of free space, of free action, then they'll just get rid of the voting part
Right. Or bring in climate assemblies or,
of it. Yeah,
you
but
know,
they won't be voted on.
right. It'll
Yeah,
be, yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's ridiculous.
They'll be technocrats. I mean, this goes back to the progressive era.
Yeah.
The at least in America, it probably goes back longer in Europe, but in the progressive era in America, we had vast resources, and the progressives thought they were being squandered. And they said, if we just have a scientific, technological elite managing resources, not in the East where they actually lived, but out West where they didn't live, and they were afraid too many people were moving, um, then it would be better. So we'll have this technological elite that's not controlled by democracy. uh, they didn't want that. Democracy is messing things up. They're allowing people to. They pass homestead laws that allow people to move to the West and just take over land and manage it willy nilly when we know better how they ought to manage the land. So they foreclosed the homestead laws. They said we're going to have professional foresters managing the forest. And so what we have is huge conflagrations and wildfires because the managing of the forest right now is dominated by let nature take its course, as opposed to active management, which to the progressives' credit, they said conservation means use. Forests were to provide products for the betterment of American society. That's why it's in the agriculture department, for example. But that changed over time. Now environmentalism is in the ascendancy, and it's not for timber production. It's for whatever, whole ecosystems or whatever. But letting nature take its course winds up in millions of acres of forest burning to the ground every year.
Right.
So, but that's the elite management. You gotta like it when those elites are managing things. Uh,
So, why do you think so many businesses, like large corporations and politicians, and there's quite a few in America who are embracing the Great Reset, the net zero and ESG scores? I mean, why do you think they're embracing this?
because they're part of the elite. They're the problem. uh, there, there may in their initial efforts to reach office be some really good politicians that want to do good things, and by good things I mean want to follow the law, want people to be free, want to ensure that laws don't overly restrict liberty and dictate to people. Um, but the political process itself, um, pretty much corrupts them over time. I think there are a few that hold out, but most politicians are part of the elite. They either became politicians because it was personal aggrandizement for them. It's an odd thing when you can't have earned more than $50,000 a year before you take office, but when you leave office, you're a multimillionaire. That's a public servant.
Exactly.
So they either use public office for personal aggrandizement and gain. I don't know a single politician who leaves public office poorer. Well, honestly, Trump may be poorer now than when he went in, but most of them don't. Um, but and then there's the other type of politician who gets into it because, once again, as I said, they have a vision of the world. They see problems and they say, I know best how to solve these problems, and I know best how people ought to live. And so they're the paternalist, and they're to some extent more dangerous than the ones that are in it for their own gain. I mean, what is the I wish I could recall the quote, but it compares mobsters to government, and it says mobsters might be satiated. They only care that you pay them off. They don't care how you live at home. But moral scolds, no. They care about everything you do. So,
Yes.
that's the situation we're in is we've got two classes of I think bullies. One that are bullies for their own gain, and the other that are bullies supposedly for your well-being. They're paternalist, and that's the arrogance because there is no person or group of people. If you're a Christian, you believe there's a God, and God may know every individual person's what his best life would look like, his or her best life would look like. But there ain't a human being that does, and there's not a group of human beings that do.
Well, you said that America is a republic, and so it may have some sort of resistance, internal resistance to this push to remake the world and everything. But so do you think that America will adopt this through the Green New Deal and its commitments to the Paris Agreement and whatnot? I mean,
Well,
is
they'll go
is there
as far
hope
as they
that they could
can.
be resisted?
Look, they'll go as far as they can. I don't think the Green New Deal has a chance of enactment. Um, Even too many Democrats don't support it because their personal oxes get gored. Um, their constituency gets shafted and hurt, and so because they want to be reelected, they're not going to do something uh, that very, very visibly will destroy the economies and the peoples of their state. Um, so I don't think the Green New Deal as a whole has a chance, but parts of it do, and certainly, we're back in the Paris Climate Agreement. Whether we will be 4 years from now if Biden doesn't win re-election, or a Democrat, or his successor from the Democratic Party, be that Kamala Harris or whoever, doesn't hold the presidency, whether we will still be in the Paris Agreement and whether it will reverse things once again. Um, I don't pretend to have a crystal ball to predict that. So I think some bad things will happen. We will move farther down the road, to socialism. Um, but to be fair, that happens almost every legislative session and every executive, no matter who the president or controls Congress. Republicans are budget hawks when Democrats hold the presidency. They worry about deficits. They worry about restraining government. Heck, it was Bill Clinton that says the era of big government is over. And yet, government never shrinks.
Yeah.
And when Republicans control Congress and then there's a Republican president, they spend just like Democrats did. So it's not as if government shrinks ever. So we're on the slow road to ever more government, and we can slow it. And I'd like to think we can reverse it. we started to during Trump. Reagan did a bit, but you know, for every one step back, um, the next administration, the next Congress takes three steps forward. So,
Yeah.
I'm unfortunately, I know I sound like a pessimist. I look around the world and I say, look, Russia is not where it was 40 years ago, and that's a good thing. Um, the wall has fallen, and people in Eastern Europe are more free than they were 40 years ago. And in truth, people are more free in China than they were 40 years ago. So freedom does make gains, but as the founders of America rightly pointed out, you've got to be a guardian of your freedoms, your hard-won freedoms.
Right. Yeah.
You've got to be constantly on the lookout. And the thing that you need to be on the lookout more is the snake oil salesman who tells you you need more government control of your life for your own good.
I want to bring China in for a second because some say that China is embracing the Great Reset and net zero, and undoubtedly, undoubtedly, China does have people working with the World Economic Forum for probably other reasons.
Yeah.
But it's one thing to help craft the destruction of one's opponent, and
Yeah.
another to participate in it oneself. So, do you believe China is serious about bringing the Great Reset to China and following a net zero plan for itself?
Well, to be fair, uh, to some extent, China is the model of the Great Reset, right? It has private industry and private property, and the government decides what they basically decides when they can do something and where they can trade and who they can trade with. And if they don't like what's going on, they restrict exports and they restrict imports. And uh, so China would like to see that for the entire world, as long as China is the one making those decisions. But what China is not doing is giving up fossil fuels.
Right.
They may say they embrace net zero, but saying it's like the Wizard of Oz. They say all the right things, but then they say ignore the man behind the curtain, because what they're doing is just the opposite of what they're saying. And Trump called them on this. Trump said China. He pointed out China is building power plants, coal-fired power plants, coal-fueled power plants, faster than ever. They're putting out more emissions. And to his credit, Trump didn't blame them for this. He says they're trying to do what's best for their people and economy, which is what leaders are supposed to do. I wish every president took that point of view and says what we're supposed to do. We're not heads of a world government. We're heads of the American government, and we're supposed to do what's best for the American people.
That's
and
right.
hopefully what's best for the American people, as it was in the past, is for America to be a shining beacon of freedom that people around the world admire and wish to follow in the footsteps of, as far as producing goods and services, becoming wealthier. Because when we become wealthier, we also spend more on environmental goods. Wealthier people
That's right.
do. Poor people destroy environments. Wealthier people spend more and more of their discretionary income protecting the environment. So we should lead by example, not by force.
That's a really good point, because for the longest time, America was leading by example. You had uh, energy independence under Trump, and kind of showed the way that you can, if emissions are such a big deal, it's possible to reduce them with natural gas and so on, and was able to export natural gas and help reduce energy dependence in Europe and around the world, dependent on OPEC and Russia and so on. And so now, with the net zero push and keeping fossil fuels in the ground in North, only apply to Western countries
Yeah.
and Western companies. And meanwhile, China's buying up things. And so
Not just China.
you have
Biden
not just
doesn't want
other.
Biden doesn't want pipelines in America, but he approves. He takes off
The
the
Russian,
sanctions
yeah,
Trump imposed on the Russian pipelines. Right.
right.
Uh, the Europeans want to impose a carbon tax on goods from other countries that don't have environmental conditions the equivalent of their own,
Yeah,
except for China. No,
yeah,
no, we're not going to stop.
exactly.
So it's like it's very selective. This concern for the ending of fossil fuels and net zero, because for anyone to pretend that China is on the path to net zero or Russia is they don't have their heads in the sand. They're just stupid. They're blind. Um, th- so um, it's an odd thing, you know. It goes. You look at Massachusetts a few years ago. Massachusetts won't allow any natural gas pipelines to be built. You
Yeah,
know, they stymie every effort. They've had a couple of towns that tried to ban new natural gas hookups in their towns. So if you build a house, you can't have natural gas stove or natural gas water heater or anything. You got to go all electric.
yeah.
Um, and so a few years ago, they had a really cold spell, and rather than having American natural gas shipped in safely through pipelines to heat Americans' homes and for Americans to cook over. At the same time as they were complaining, legislators and politicians from Massachusetts were complaining that Trump was in the pocket of Russia. They were importing natural gas from Russia. They were directly sending money to Vladimir Putin's billfold. So
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
if you talk to Vladimir Putin and you don't call him a dictator, you're in his pocket. But if you actually pay him for something, to the exclusion of paying Americans for something, you're gold. It's hypocrisy on display.
Well, and right now there's the environmental activists are trying to stop two pipelines from Canada going into the United States. They've already torched Keystone again,
Yep.
but there's the two Enbridge pipelines, Line 3, which they're redoing because it's a bit old and they've been refurbishing it, and they're just on the last stretch of refurbishment. And
Yep.
then Line 5, which runs through the United States and then back up into Canada.
Mm.
And they're trying to shut that one down. So it's not just trying to shut down the American fossil fuel industry, but also Canada, because everything, and it's the Western
No,
companies, and it's the Western development as well. And
the
as you
Demo-
say, Russia benefits,
yeah,
China benefits, the Middle East benefits, everybody who isn't a Western company
democracy,
or
yeah,
country or democracy.
or
Yeah.
Republica. Yeah. No, look, um, uh, it was complained all the time that Trump went his own way. He had no diplomatic skills. Blah 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 blah. Um, but gee, he approved the pipeline from Canada and he approved the Enbridge pipelines. He said, "Look, now you got to have these things." Um, the first thing Biden does when he comes into office is shafts our allies. The first thing he does is said, I'm the president of jobs, and the first thing I'm going to do in the midst of the worst economic situation since the Great Depression is to put more people out of work, more union people out of work uh, than any president in history. I'm going to close down the pipeline day one. In the process, um, violating an agreement that I have with our closest ally, Canada. Now that's
I know.
diplomacy. I'm telling you, that's a sound foreign policy.
I want to talking about jobs. Kristalina Georgieva of the IMF has come out several times, as many of progressives do, and they say that renewables are this amazing job creator. And they always say that compared to fossil fuel based energy, renewable creates way more jobs and so on. And I mean, one could make the argument that, hey, peasant agriculture creates way more jobs in the field compared to industrial farming. So maybe we ought to go back to peasant farming.
Well,
Um,
they want that, right? They want that.
well, that too.
That's the goal.
Because I mean, if you look at how the EU is doing their Green Deal and what they're planning for agriculture, and they're facing a lot of pushback from the various member states because they know that if they can't produce food, people there's unrest. But the EU is still pushing for 30% to be organic and all these different biodiversity requirements and so on. So, I mean, part of that whole structure of the Great Reset, the Green New Deals, and so on is also affecting agriculture as well as the fossil
Yeah.
fuel industry. But um, one of the things I thought about this renewables being a job creator is the contradictions. So we have the environmental movement saying we need a circular economy. You can't have too much stuff. We need to reduce the human built environment and so on. And yet here they're pushing for renewables, which have this enormous environmental human footprint. They require so much mining, so much refining. Um, you have to use so much compared to what you need to get an equivalent amount of energy from a thermal power plant or a nuclear power plant or something. So it's these inherent contradictions of saying this will create more jobs and everything else, but at the same time, it will create a lot of environmental destruction.
Well, it tells me that they're not really. They call themselves environmentalists, and they're not really concerned about the environment. Once again, they're lying.
They're lying. It's not about
They're
climate.
lying.
It's not
It's not
about the
about.
environment.
No, it's about one group of people telling everybody else how to live, and and how to live is not an environmentally sound um, way.
Yes, and I
So,
thought Mark.
in the end, it's not about the environment. It's not about protecting resources. It's about controlling how people live.
Yeah.
And because they know um, that that renewable energy does not um, work, does not provide as much energy, and does not provide sound energy, reliable energy, people will, of necessity, have to live with less, which is the goal. That's
Yeah.
their ultimate goal. Is everybody must live lower standards of living. They've said in the past we want zero growth. Well, this is a way to zero growth and no growth.
Or degrowth. I mean, there's
Degrowth.
also
Yeah,
the
yeah.
degrowth movement.
Yeah,
And
that's the point. Is they tout it. They know they can't tell everyone you're going to have to live with less. So they say, "Oh, this is going to create lots of jobs. We're going to have all this economic growth. It's going to be great." When in reality, they know that what it's going to do is destroy jobs, destroy lives, and make people live with less.
yeah.
But they
So,
can't say that openly.
right. And so this is the point about net zero. There's at least two, I would say, definitions for net zero. There's the public one where it says that, excuse me, one pathway means allowing only the emissions that are canceled out by carbon sinks and so on, and that it's actually just swapping one form of energy for another. So they tell people, oh, you'll still have a car, it'll just be electric. You'll still have heating and everything, it'll just be electric, and maybe you have to pay a little bit more, but you can pretty much keep your same way of life and standard of living and so on. But then there's a second pathway, and it's the one that where they're saying it's absolute zero emission from human activity, zero use of any hydrocarbons for any purpose, significant degrowth that shrinks production and consumption, which means you don't get a car, you have to change your house is too big, you can't use as much energy and so on. You have what's sufficient. And I think that's what they really mean. But the first one is what they're telling everybody. They're telling everyone, oh, we're just swapping one thing for another. And I think it's really important to try and make clear to people what net zero actually means, because this it's bandied about and people throw the term around. But I think the public in general doesn't really understand what it means because they're not saying what it really means.
Well, and the and probably most of the public, if when you present this to them, they say, "Oh, well, they can't really mean that." They don't believe that there are some people who really just are misanthropes. They don't like people.
Yeah. Very
That
anti-human.
very anti-human progress. There are some people that just are, and it's hard for people who aren't to understand that mindset. Just like it's hard for people, for thankfully the vast majority of people, to think like and to understand sociopaths. Right? You don't go around thinking, ah, boy, I wish I could just wipe out half of my neighborhood. There are people that are like that. They're called sociopaths or psychopaths, but most people don't think like that, and they don't understand people who do. This by the same token, they don't understand misanthropes and people who really, really have visions of the world where they think the ideal lifestyle is eating grubs and locusts,
Yeah.
and living on dirt floors.
With your maybe you'll get electricity for 10 minutes.
Yeah, yeah. Look, my
In the,
wife's from my wife's from Venezuela. At one time, it was the richest country on the South American continent, and they have turned it into, they had regular energy,
yeah.
24/7. Um, uh, they don't have that anymore.
No.
And yet you've got Westerners, Hollywood types that go down there and praise the socialist revolution. That's the problem with socialism. You can't. There's no system that can make everyone as rich as everyone else, because that requires individual effort, and not everyone puts in that effort. Not everyone is as smart as everyone else and can figure out the next new mousetrap. But you can have a political system that makes everyone as poor as everyone else. That's called
Yeah.
socialism, and that's the snake oil that the Great Reset is selling.
Well, where do you think the ESG scores fit into this?
Well, it's trying to force corporations to kowtow to climate alarmism and to the Great Reset. It's trying to say you were formed as a business. People invest in you, buy your stocks and bonds, your funds, because they want to make a profit. When they retire, they want to live better. They want to live well. They don't want to live in poverty. And so they invest in businesses. They could invest in nonprofits. They could put all their money into charities if they wanted to. They don't. They invest in businesses because businesses make profits and return on investments. And the global elite says, no, 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 we can't have that. We need everybody rowing the same direction. Climate, corporate governments, sustainability, they have to be the hallmarks, not profit. And because companies don't kowtow to that naturally, you pass laws and rules that force them to kowtow to that. Now, of course, some big companies embrace it. Why? Because they know they'll be the ones that survive.
Yeah.
Right? If
There's the opportunists for sure.
Yeah, they're the opportunists. You get your payoff from government. Government pays you not to fight it too hard, rewards you in some way or the other, and your competitors go under.
Yeah. And you get more market share.
So you got crony capitalism combined with socialism, dragging everyone down, and that's why some of them are embracing ESG, because they know under ESG they'll do okay, and they won't have to compete as much with those who don't do well under ESG or who don't embrace it. But it's the idea that we should all be rowing in the same direction, and that's not what capitalism and free markets is about. Is we all row in our own directions.
Yeah.
I see a vision of how I want to live, and I do my darndest to reach that goal. And you see a vision for you, and you do your darndest to reach that goal. Our goals may or may not be the same. The elite wants everyone's goal to be the same, and in this case, what that goal is zero carbon dioxide emissions, zero greenhouse gas emissions. That's the only important goal as far as they're concerned.
And you know what?
So in the process, people have to starve and die. We're so worried. We're so worried that our beachfront properties may experience 3 inches more sea level rise than they would have otherwise 100 years from now. We're willing to condemn a billion people to die in the meantime from starvation, from privation, from lack of energy, because they can't go to a hospital in the middle of the night because, well, the solar panels we provide them for their hospital, they don't provide power in the middle of the night, so they don't have refrigeration. We're willing to condemn current generations so that future generations might live a little bit better off than they would have otherwise.
Yeah. Right now, people think, well, those are corporations or maybe investors, and it's not going to affect me too much. But I think that it won't be too scores introduced on. People will say, well, hey, if I'm doing all these amazing things, and I have all the fluorescent bulbs or whatever, then I should get a better insurance rate. And then the insurance companies will be offering these better insurance rates if you have a higher ESG score.
It's worse than that. There's a program on TV. What's it called? Black Box, Black. It's all about technology.
Black Mirror.
Yeah.
That episode
where everything is done on social media scores. And
Yeah.
so your whole reputation, someone tells a lie about you and it destroys you. And your credit's gone. Your ability to travel is gone.
Yeah.
It's prophetic. And that's where they're moving, right?
Well, because it's so similar to what's actually going on in China
Yeah.
right now with the social credit score. I mean, it determines where you live, if your children can go to the right school, if you can take the train, if you can fly somewhere, or even if you're allowed to have your name in the lottery for a license plate for a car.
Yeah.
So
No. It's scary, but that's where we're moving. And the ESG score is just one step towards that. If it weren't a mandatory thing, honestly, I wouldn't care much. If the government weren't involved, if people want to make investments based on what they think a company's environmental stance is or isn't and should or shouldn't be, that's their business. But when government tells businesses they've got to take all this stuff into account, that's wrong.
yes, and because who's coming up with those standards? One, they shouldn't be having those standards in the first place. Two, who's coming up with them? Three, who will be monitoring it? And it adds yet another layer of bureaucracy, especially for smaller businesses. So, it's no wonder the accounting firms are excited about it.
Yeah. There's a reason why tax preparers never want simplified taxes.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know anyone at H&R Block that liked the idea of the flat tax or the national sales tax to replace the personal income tax with all the deductions. I don't know those people, and I don't know. The thing is, you sort of answered your own question earlier. You said who will be in charge. Well, we know who will be in charge: Klaus Schwab, Al Gore, Barack
Mark
Obama.
Carney.
The German
Angela Merkel,
and their advisors from the green environmental parties and the radicals. That's who will be in charge of deciding all these things. We know that. And that's precisely why we can't have them making these decisions.
Well, Mark Carney put forward the suggestion that there ought to be carbon councils that would be appointed by government so that they would be at arm's length, because politicians tend to want to, they have to be accountable to the voters. And so therefore, with these appointed carbon councils, they will be the ones who will make the determination of what the emissions levels will be and so on.
Yeah, it's the progressive ideal of technocrats running everything.
Exactly.
That we unelected bureaucrats will be, we can't have politics mucking about with our vision. And of course, who will be on the carbon councils. It won't be the average Joe or Jane. And you know why? For the same reason that we talk about rational ignorance in voting. Most people don't have time to sit around reading every candidate's platform and knowing what their actions were in the past before they go vote on them.
Yeah.
If they vote at all. I I can't tell you what somebody's stance on healthcare for the most part is, what somebody's stance on uh, all sorts of issues would be. I know a lot about the environment. And so I know when I go to vote, I know someone's environment stance. I don't know what their stance on every other thing is. And I don't have time. Most people actually work for a living. And because they work and when they get home, they want to relax, um, it's not like they're spending the rest of their time on the computer trying to find out everything about every candidate and everything about every policy. They're not going to be on the carbon councils. Who are is basically either trust fund environmentalists, rich environmentalists, or extremely poor environmentalists who are, basically welfare people who have the free time to do nothing but worry about carbon.
And academics.
And the ultimate welfare recipients, right?
Well,
Once they get tenure, uh, uh, it's gold. It's
well,
gravy.
except if they're a climate skeptic,
Well,
right?
then they don't get tenure.
Well, if they have tenure, then they get shoveled out.
Yeah, they get moved to lesser departments, or well, that's right. But the point is, they won't be the ones on the councils. The ones that already agree with the elite. The elite will decide who gets approved on the councils. Remember,
Right.
somebody's got
Yeah.
to appoint the councils that are going to be above politics. Well,
Exactly.
there's politics that goes into that appointment.
Well, in Canada, they appointed a council or a task force or whatever who's supposed to come up with these net zero requirements that would be applicable to the country. And
Yeah.
there's, I think, 12 people or 14 people, and it's just the usual academic
probably someone like
stakeholders and so on,
David
right?
Suzuki and someone like that, right? The people that you expect to be, because that's what they care about on those councils. And I want you to think about what you just said. For Canada, 12 people make these decisions.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I don't know Canada's population, but I'm guessing it's around 28 million people.
35 million.
Oh, okay, 35 million.
Million.
So 12 people decide for 35 million people everything.
Yeah.
That's a
fair.
democratic system. That's a system you can be sure will meet the needs of everyone.
Yeah, and don't get me started on climate assemblies because they're just equally just a travesty, really a travesty.
Yeah.
But when Mark Morano was on your podcast, and he said to you that by conceding the premises of the climate change, climate emergency narrative, by conceding those points, not question the science, and by conceding the point that climate is a problem, then all that's being argued is that the Green New Deal and whatnot is just too expensive. And I think he was so bang on. Republicans or conservatives around the world, in the Western world, have totally conceded that point. And when you concede that, then when it's supposed to be the rationale for all this stuff that we're doing, the net zero and the ESG scores and all that stuff, if you concede that point, then what do you have left?
Yeah, no, once you concede that point, it's just a matter of deciding the best way to reduce carbon emissions. What's the most efficient? What's the most effective? What we'll have to do in the quickest amount of time? And the sad, well, actually, it's not the sad fact. The happy fact is we don't have to concede that point. If you look at the world, contrary to what I hear often, the world does not face climate change does not pose an existential threat to human survival. You know who tells me that with their actions? A guy named Barack Obama, former president of the United States, goes in 1,000-aire, comes out a millionaire. He says climate change threatens sea level rise. It's terrible. It's getting worse. It's getting faster. Coasts will be swamped. We must do something. And he retires. He's no longer in office. And where does he buy his new home? On a low-lying barrier island less than a foot above sea level. how big a threat does he really think climate change is to his
Yeah.
well-being and his family's well-being? It can't be much, because if he's right, that house won't be here in 100 years.
That's right.
Um, Al Gore in his actions tells me that. He starts a television company. And when he sells that television company, who does he sell it to for millions of dollars? He sells it to, I think, Oman or the UAE, the Arab Emirates, uh, which is funded by oil.
Yeah.
So he says, I'm giving basically oil barons, oil aristocracy, access to American airwaves for millions of dollars. He lives in 20,000 square foot homes, a home that even after he put solar panels on his home, his energy usage went up. And so his energy usage goes up. He has this huge home, multiple homes, by the way, not just one.
Of course.
And but he sells us, and he flies in private jets, but he tells us we shouldn't even fly.
We shouldn't travel at all, right?
We shouldn't travel at all, right?
Yeah.
And so his house, one of his houses, uses more energy in a month than mine uses in a year. His bill is higher in a month than I spend in a year. That tells me that they're not really worried about climate change as an existential threat. When you really believe something, you live that way.
And I think that
You
applies,
live as if you believe it.
and I think that applies also to the NGOs, because if they truly believed we were facing a climate emergency and that people were going to die and suffer, then they would be supporting nuclear energy. If they really thought this was a big problem, they would be doubling down and saying, come on, you guys, build more nuclear power plants. And they would also be promoting carbon capture, because the Carbon X Prize or whatever has been won, and they were able to actually extract carbon dioxide directly from a power plant and make cindercrete blocks out of it, and then sell the cindercrete blocks. And the guys are like, wow, this is so amazing. We can capture all these emissions. And so what do the environmental groups do? Be removed from the climate plan
Yeah,
about the climate.
it's not about the climate. It's not about it's about controlling people's lives. And nuclear and carbon capture allows the continued use of fossil fuels, and nuclear allows a steady electricity even if you don't have fossil fuels. If you got enough nuclear, I mean,
Yeah.
that's what France does. 70% of its energy comes from nuclear.
Yeah.
But that doesn't restrict how people live.
That's
They
right.
still have regular electricity. They still have refrigeration, air conditioning on demand, and refrigeration that works 24 hours a day. Basically, they still live wealthy lifestyles, relatively wealthy compared to past generations. And so we can't have that, because it's not really about helping people live better or preventing a climate crisis. It's about controlling how people live and
Absolutely.
ensuring that they live lower standard lifestyles.
And then they change it. They change the metric. That what they want to do is change it from GDP. They argue beyond GDP, and that it should all be based on a well-being index. So then people would say, well, how do you feel? Do you feel like you have a nice calmness, and what's your well-being? And then that's how they'll determine whether a country is successful.
Yeah,
They
well,
want to throw GDP
they
out.
because GDP is actually based on hard numbers. You can
Yeah.
calculate GDP without reference to emotions or feelings.
Yeah.
But
Subjectivity.
it's not subjective. Whereas the other is completely subjective, and importantly, it's subjective because the people who decide what counts in the well-being meter are the ones that want to restrain how you live.
Right. And will you
You know,
get a low social
we need
credit
we
score if
need
you say no?
yeah, we need a new methodology to calculate well-being, and we just happen to know how that is done. And here are the new standards, and it just so happens that none of them are actually mathematically calculable. It's all based on a climate Rorschach test.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way of putting it. So just one last thing about this, because there's economist Mariana Mazzucato has argued for climate lockdowns, and a Deutsche Bank researcher asked for an honest discussion in the EU, saying that there they there might need to be an eco dictatorship in order to get people's behaviors to change and so on. And there was another academic study stating it'll be impossible to meet net zero if we don't basically get rid of cars. So, should people take these ideas seriously? Are they, as we've been discussing, I think the answer is yes. I think these people are very serious about pushing
Oh
these
no,
ideas
these
forward.
are serious people. These are serious people with pushing seriously dangerous ideas. Um, you have to take them seriously when they say that. And what they say, so, like I said, what you get is glimmers of honesty. So sometimes someone says something that that shows their true feelings, and when they do, you should highlight that and hammer it again and again and again. When they say, well, what we need is an eco dictatorship,
Yeah.
they're being honest.
Yeah.
They're finally showing their true colors. It's not about democracy and representation and helping the masses. It's about someone telling you how to live, because that's what dictators do. They're finally being honest when they say things like this. You've got to get rid of your car. And if you won't do it voluntarily, by God, we'll have an environmental dictator make you.
Yeah. So, how do people fight back? Just to conclude, I mean, what suggests resist this?
Well, vote if you can find a candidate worth voting for that says, I care about whatever country you're in Canada. I care about Canada first. I care about America first. And I'm here to help the American people live the lives they want to live, not the life I think they should be living. I'm here to follow the law. But that's only one thing. Stand up to bullies. Don't allow them to teach this thing in public schools. When a minister stands up, I'm not talking about a church minister, though it may happen in church as well. I'm talking about like Canada has ministers. We have department heads, directors of agencies, but you have ministers.
Yes.
When a minister goes on the stump and starts talking about the need to control growth or to sacrifice for the environment, say, no, that's not what we're about. We're about making lives better for ourselves, our children, and our children's children. And that doesn't mean living in hair shirts without air conditioning and without refrigeration and having millions of people die like they did previously from food rotting prematurely. It means using the chemicals that make life better. You just have to constantly call them out on it and get rid of them if they don't get the message. One thing about it is, if you got rid of every politician that pulled this crap, pretty soon politicians would stop pulling the crap, because what politicians are about is staying in office.
Yeah.
If every time someone spoke up and said, we got to get rid of cars, you've just got to sacrifice and take the train or stay home. If he was voted out of office the next time, I guarantee you the people running for his position wouldn't have that position.
Well, Mark Carney made an interesting point. He said, look, we need to cultivate politicians on both sides of the aisle so that regardless of which party is in power, they will continue with this pursuit. And, it's rather sad to see, in the United States, there's the rhinos and the never Trumpers or whatever. And in Canada, our Conservative Party has a new leader who's now jumped on the climate change bandwagon. And MPs, members of parliament who've kind of pushed back on this, they get sort of turfed from caucus and whatnot. So it's a bit unsettling.
Hammer the science.
Everything you said, I agree with, but it's a bit unsettling to see how people, the leaders, are not listening. And even when there's pushback, they just double down.
Well, show up at the public meetings and say, "Show me the science." And when they say, "Well, the IPCC says," no, that's not what I said. I didn't say. Show me what a politically appointed body. It's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Don't tell me what they say. Show me the data that shows hurricanes have gotten worse. Show me the data that shows wildfires are worse than they were 1,000 years ago. Show me the data. And if you can show me that, then I'll believe it. But until then, don't tell me, well, 97%, blah, blah, blah. No, that's not how science works. Science doesn't work. It's not a majoritarian democracy.
Especially science.
Science said the earth was flat. Galileo said it wasn't, and he was right. Science said disease is caused by humors in the body and an imbalance of humors in the body. And Pasteur and others says, no, it's caused by these little things called microbes. Majoritarian science is not science. It's just politics by other means.
That's right. I think that's a really important point about the pushback, which is what Mark Morano was saying as well, that you really have to call it out and say, you can't concede that point that, oh, well, people are contributing and so on and so forth, and therefore we have to stop living our lives because of this. When, there's which
Ask them what
scientists
they mean. Ask them what they mean. Ask them what they mean when they say it's an existential threat. Ask them, what does the word existential mean? I guarantee you most of the people that use that phrase can't define it. They've never looked it up in the dictionary, but they heard someone say it. It sounds pretty big. Sounds important.
Sounds intelligent.
Sounds intelligent, so they say it. But ask them to define existential and then show me why that's a threat to human life. Show me why. Society will be wiped out if, as has happened for the last 12,000 years, seas continue to rise until the next ice age come, modestly.
One last point I just wanted to make before we go is I have this concern that they're going to push forward with all these different policies, these net zero things, which will be disastrous or whatever. But then there'll be like a grand solar minimum, which some scientists are predicting will happen probably after 2030 or so. And then all these guys, the Great Reset people will say, see, look, it worked. We can do more.
These same people were arguing. The interesting thing is about these people is no matter what the problem is, the solution is always the same.
Always
in the 70s, always bigger government. In the 70s, the problem was global cooling. The next ice age was coming. And the answer was we need bigger government plans to solve that and to prevent the glaciers from coming into Chicago. Now it's global warming. It'll be endangered species. It'll be, pick your poison.
Yeah.
No matter what the so-called existential threat to human survival is, the answer is always bigger, more powerful government and smaller realm of personal liberty for people.
Yes.
And one final thing for me to conclude. You asked how people can respond. Well, I advocate, and I'm not trying to be too egotistical here, but you've mentioned climate at a glance, climate realism. If you want the facts on climate change, on the science of climate change, go there and see what we've written. Go to the internet, the non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change, doesn't have a single government-appointed scientist, and look at their documents that show what the real science shows about tropical diseases and their spread, about whether people do worse or better in warmer versus colder environments, about whether hurricanes are becoming more frequent or less frequent, seas are rising faster or slower or have not changed at all. The data is out there. You don't have to search too hard to find it. So if it's an issue that's important to you, and I think it should be, because the politicians, it's important to the people that want to restrain your liberty. So it should be
Yeah.
important to you if you want to maintain your liberty. Go to these sites I've suggested, read the material, and be able to confront them every time they say something that's just a flat out lie.
Yeah, that's very good advice. Thank you. Um, just one last thing. I noticed that in October, Heartland Institute is going to be hosting an event, The Great Reset: Climate Realism versus Climate Socialism. Um, is that going to be held in Las Vegas? Is that correct?
Las Vegas at Caesar Palace.
Okay, so
You
if
can you
people
can
are,
contact you can contact the people at the Heartland Institute. Tell them you want some tickets. Sign up for the hotel. We're going to have a block of hotel suites. Um, get in and get in cheaper. Get in early and get in cheaper, before the rooms run out. So they can do that. That's one thing where we'll be talking about the current state of the science that you may not hear on. Uh, is it CNBC, the Canadian Broadcasting System? I don't know. There's a CNBC, but
now there's a CBC, the Canadian
CBC.
Broadcasting. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you're not going to hear these stories for the most part. There are some places in Canada that you get the truth about climate change. I've seen some media outlets. You might check out America Out Loud. It's called America Out Loud, but it's run by a Canadian who runs the International Climate Science Coalition. You might check a few of those websites out. You might check the news items, but always be skeptical, because that's how science progresses. And
That's right.
anytime someone wants power, be skeptical.
That's a good way to end the conversation, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time out, despite the technological snafus. And I thank you so much for your insights, and I wish you all the best with the Heartland Institute, and I hope that the listeners will check out some of those sites that you mentioned. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on. If I can ever be of help again on a topic, don't hesitate to contact me.